On February 4th, 1912, a beautiful winter Sunday afternoon at Niagara Falls turned into tragedy in a matter of seconds. The Niagara River, partially frozen, had formed a massive ice bridge downstream from the falls, a spectacular natural formation that attracted thousands of tourists who would walk out onto the ice. On this particular day, dozens of people were on the ice bridge when, without warning, it began to break apart. The ice shifted, cracked, and started moving downstream, carrying terrified people with it. 3 people died that day, swept away on ice floes, crushed between grinding ice chunks, or drowned in the freezing river. This is the story of the Niagara Falls ice bridge disaster, a tragedy that ended a beloved winter tradition and showed the deadly danger of trusting nature's frozen beauty. Niagara Falls, straddling the border between the United States and Canada, is one of the most famous waterfalls in the world. The falls consist of 3 waterfalls: Horseshoe Falls, mostly on the Canadian side, American Falls, and Bridal Veil Falls. Combined, they produce an enormous volume of water flowing from Lake Erie to Lake Ontario via the Niagara River. In winter, the extreme cold of the region often creates spectacular ice formations. The mist from the falls freezes on trees, rocks, and anything nearby, creating winter wonderlands of ice. But the most impressive formation was what locals called the ice bridge. The ice bridge wasn't a bridge in the traditional sense. It was a natural formation of ice that would sometimes form downstream from the falls during particularly cold winters. The ice would build up from chunks and blocks that had frozen and jammed together in the river gorge below the falls, creating a relatively stable platform of ice that could stretch across the entire width of the river. By the early 1900s, the ice bridge had become a major winter tourist attraction. When conditions were right and the ice bridge formed, thousands of people would descend the steep paths to the river gorge and walk out onto the ice. Vendors set up temporary shops on the ice, selling photographs, souvenirs, food, and hot drinks. People would cross from the American side to the Canadian side and back, all while standing on frozen river ice between 2 countries. It was a festive, carnival-like atmosphere. Families would bundle up and make a day of it. Couples would pose for photographs on the ice with the frozen falls as a backdrop. Children would play. The ice bridge was seen as perfectly safe after all. It was thick enough to support hundreds of people and had existed for weeks or even months during winter. But ice is deceptive. It looks solid and permanent, but it's always subject to changes in temperature, water flow, and the immense forces of the river beneath it. February 4th, 1912, was a Sunday, a popular day for tourism. It was a relatively mild winter day with temperatures around freezing, 32 degree F/0 degrees C. The ice bridge had been stable for several weeks, and thousands of people had visited it safely. There was no reason to think this day would be any different. By afternoon, dozens of people were on the ice bridge. Among them were several couples, families, and groups of friends. The exact number of people on the ice at the moment disaster struck is unclear. Estimates range from 30 to 50 people or more. Among those on the ice were Eldridge Stanton, a 25-year-old man from Toronto; Burrell and Clara Hecock, a 17-year-old from Cleveland, Ohio, visiting with his parents; Ignacy Wendel, a 35-year-old man from Cleveland, and many others whose names are lost to history. The Hecock family, Burrell, 17, his mother Clara, and his father William, were tourists from Cleveland who had come to see the famous Niagara Falls in winter. They ventured onto the ice bridge like so many others, excited to experience this unique natural phenomenon. Around 4:30 p.m., as afternoon was turning to evening and some people were beginning to head back to shore, something changed. Witnesses on the shore reported hearing a sound like thunder or a cannon shot the sound of ice cracking. Then with terrifying suddenness, the ice bridge began to break apart. The massive platform of ice that had seemed so solid started to shift. Cracks appeared, widening in seconds. Huge chunks of ice began separating from each other. The ice wasn't just breaking apart. It was beginning to move, being pushed by the powerful current of the Niagara River. People on the ice had immediately realized they were in mortal danger. Panic erupted. People started running toward shore, trying to reach safety before the ice carried them downstream. Some made it. Some didn't. The ice was moving faster than people could run. The shore, which had been just yards away, was suddenly unreachable as the gap widened. Chunks of ice tilted and rolled. People fell into the water or had to jump from one ice chunk to another. The grinding of massive ice blocks created a deafening roar. From the shore, hundreds of horrified witnesses watched the disaster unfold. They could see people stranded on ice floes, desperately trying to stay aboard as the ice moved downstream. They could hear the screams, but there was nothing they could do. No boats could be launched in the ice-filled river. No ropes could reach far enough. The ice floes carrying people were heading toward the Whirlpool Rapids, a notoriously dangerous section of the Niagara River, about 3 miles downstream where the river makes a sharp turn and the water becomes extremely turbulent. If the ice reached the rapids, anyone still on it would almost certainly die. The Hecock family was split apart in the chaos. William Hecock managed to leap from ice chunk to ice chunk and reach the American shore, though he was injured in the process. But his wife, Clara, and their teenage son, Burrell, were on a large ice floe that was rapidly moving downstream, unable to reach safety. Also on the same ice floe or nearby were Ignatius Roth and Eldridge Stanton. These people found themselves in a nightmarish situation, standing on ice that was carrying them inexorably toward the deadly rapids, with no way to reach shore and no way to stop the ice. Rescue attempts began immediately. People on shore ran along the riverbanks, trying to keep the stranded people in sight. Someone called the police and fire departments. At the Toronto power plant, later Sir Adam Beck generating station on the Canadian side, workers scrambled to find some way to help. The power plant had equipment ropes, ladders, cables that might be used for rescue. Workers grabbed what they could and rushed to the shoreline. They managed to throw ropes and extend ladders, trying to reach the people on the ice floes as they drifted past. In an incredible display of bravery and luck, some people were saved. Several individuals managed to grab ropes thrown from shore and were pulled to safety, or made desperate leaps to ladders extended from the riverbank. The exact number of people who escaped from the breaking ice is unclear, but it was at least a dozen or more. But 3 people could not be saved: Clara Hecock, Burrell Hecock, and Eldridge Stanton. Clara and Burrell were on an ice floe that was moving too fast and too far from shore to be reached. Witnesses reported seeing them standing together, the mother and her teenage son, as the ice carried them downstream. They knew they were going to die. There was no escape. Eldridge Stanton was on a different ice floe, or possibly the same one, accounts vary. He was a strong young man and tried desperately to reach shore by jumping from ice chunk to ice chunk. But the ice was too unstable, and the gaps too wide. As the ice floes approached the Whirlpool Rapids, witnesses lost sight of the victims. The turbulent, ice-filled waters of the rapids are almost certainly where they died, crushed between ice chunks, swept under the ice, or drowned in the freezing water. One particularly tragic detail: William Hecock, who had made it to shore, had to watch helplessly from the American side as his wife and son were carried away. He could see them on the ice, could probably hear them calling out, but could do absolutely nothing to save them. He survived, but he lost his entire family in a matter of minutes. The bodies of Clara Hecock and Burrell Hecock were recovered several days later downstream from the rapids. The body of Eldridge Stanton was found later as well. All 3 had died from drowning, injuries from the ice, or a combination of both. The exact circumstances of each death are not known, but being caught in the Whirlpool Rapids on breaking ice would have been horrific. The disaster made national news. Newspapers across the United States and Canada reported on the tragedy. The fact that tourists had died on what was supposed to be a safe winter attraction shocked people. The image of a mother and son being carried away on ice to their deaths was heartbreaking and captured the public imagination. The immediate question was, why did the ice break up? And why then? The answer is complex and involves several factors. 1. Temperature changes. February 4th, 1912, had been relatively warm for winter around the freezing point. This warmth, after a period of colder weather, may have weakened the ice structure. 2. Water flow. The Niagara River's flow can change based on various factors, including ice conditions upstream. Increased flow or pressure from water beneath the ice could have destabilized it. 3. Natural ice movement. Ice in rivers is never truly stationary. It's subject to immense pressures from water flow and temperature changes and its own weight. The ice bridge might have looked stable, but it was always under stress. 4. Time of day. The disaster occurred late afternoons, early evening. Daytime warming, even slight, can weaken ice that refreezes at night. The ice may have been at its weakest point in the daily temperature cycle. 5. Just bad luck. Sometimes ice breaks without warning. The specific combination of factors on February 4th, 1912, created the perfect conditions for catastrophic failure. The important point is that the ice bridge, despite appearing safe and having supported thousands of people for weeks, was inherently dangerous. Ice is always unpredictable. The disaster prompted immediate calls to ban people from going onto the ice bridge. Both American and Canadian authorities faced pressure to prevent future tragedies. However, the response was surprisingly slow and inadequate. The ice bridge was on international waters between two countries, which complicated jurisdiction and enforcement. Neither side wanted to be the one to ban a popular tourist attraction that brought revenue to local businesses. In the years following 1912, people continued to go onto ice bridges when they formed, though perhaps with more caution. Vendors still set up on the ice. The attraction continued, but the real end of the ice bridge tradition came not from regulation, but from environmental change. In the 1960s, the installation of the ice boom, a floating barrier placed in Lake Erie to prevent large accumulations of ice from flowing into the Niagara River, dramatically changed ice conditions. The ice boom, designed to protect downstream hydroelectric facilities and shipping, had the side effect of preventing the formation of the massive ice bridges that used to occur regularly. The last major ice bridge formation that attracted tourists was in the 1930s. Since the ice boom's installation in 1964, ice bridges have not formed with the same stability or frequency. When ice does accumulate in the gorge, it's not stable enough for people to walk on, and modern authorities actively discourage anyone from attempting it. The 1912 disaster left behind several legacies. For the Hecock family. William Hecock lost his wife and son in front of his eyes. He returned to Cleveland alone. The trauma of watching his family carried away to their deaths must have been unbearable. His story is a stark reminder that tourist attractions can turn deadly in an instant. For Niagara Falls. The disaster became part of the fall's history, a darker chapter in a place usually associated with natural beauty and honeymoons. The ice bridge disaster is still remembered by local historians as one of the worst tragedies at Niagara Falls. For ice safety. The 1912 disaster should have been a definitive lesson about the dangers of walking on river ice, particularly in powerful rivers like the Niagara. Unfortunately, people still make the same mistakes today, walking on ice that looks safe but isn't. For tourism. The incident highlighted the tension between tourism, revenue, and safety. Authorities were slow to ban access to the ice bridge because it was popular and profitable. This same dynamic plays out today with many tourist attractions around the world. The Niagara Falls ice bridge disaster is particularly poignant because it was so preventable. The ice bridge was a known risk. Local experts had warned about the dangers. The ice was subject to powerful natural forces that made it inherently unstable. Yet, people continued to go onto the ice because it had been done before without incident. It was a popular tradition. Authorities didn't explicitly ban it. People underestimated the danger. This is a pattern seen in many disasters, risk accumulation. People do something risky, it turns out fine, so they do it again. More people join. It becomes normalized. Everyone assumes it must be safe because so many people are doing it, until the day it isn't safe, and tragedy strikes. Today, when ice does form in the Niagara Gorge below the falls, signs are posted warning people to stay off the ice. Rangers and police patrol to enforce this. Most people comply. But even now, occasionally someone ventures onto the ice for a photo or a thrill, not realizing they're risking their lives just as those tourists did in 1912. The ice bridge disaster also reminds us that nature's beauty can be deadly. Niagara Falls in winter is spectacular, the frozen mist, the ice formations, the otherworldly landscape. But that beauty masks incredible power. The Niagara River carries an enormous volume of water with tremendous force. Ice that seems solid can be moved by that force as easily as paper in the wind. The people who died on February 4th, 1912, were ordinary tourists doing what thousands of others had done. They weren't reckless thrill seekers. They were a mother and her teenage son on a vacation, and a young man enjoying a winter day. They had no reason to think they were in danger. The ice had been there for weeks. Other people were on it. Everything seemed fine, until it wasn't. The Niagara Falls ice bridge. Disaster stands as a tragic example of how quickly natural forces can turn deadly, how deceptive safety can be, and how the consequences of underestimating nature can be fatal. On February 4th, 1912, 3 people went onto the ice at Niagara Falls, expecting a pleasant tourist experience. Instead, Clara Hecock, age 43, Burrell Hecock, age 17, and Eldridge Stanton, age 25, were carried away on breaking ice and died in the whirlpool rapids. They were victims of nature's power and humanity's tendency to underestimate danger that has been safe up until the moment it isn't. The ice bridge is gone now, prevented by modern engineering and unlikely to return. But the memory of February 4th, 1912 remains as a warning. Never trust ice, never underestimate nature, and never assume that something is safe just because others are doing it. Rest in peace to Clara Hecock, Burrell Hecock, and Eldridge Stanton. They went on a winter outing to one of the world's most beautiful places, and they never came home. The ice bridge took them, and the tradition died with them.